I'm Sean Morgan, and I'm asking the hard questions about alternative topics like QAnon and coronavirus. Get the free ebook at QAnonFAQ.com. So, Simon, would you give us a little introductory to yourself about what's your journey with the Great Awakening and with health?
Yeah, absolutely, Shauna. Thanks so much for having me back. So, my story in terms of this particular piece, The Great Awakening, really started around about 2009 when I ended my then career as a lawyer in the city in London. And that was the catalyst for the start of a spiritual, a physical, and a kind of mindset journey that I went on, encompassing different practices, including yoga, breath work, and all these different other physical techniques that I now basically have come through and teach others. And we were talking really just generally about what this really means in terms of the Great Awakening, and in particular after and a major event, let's say, if one were to happen.
Okay. And so, I think that we all have our personal awakening that we go through. It's a different timelines for every person. Life really is a whole process of being born, awakening, and then even at the end of your life, things kind of dimming again. And so I had a big awakening experience when I was a teenager. That had a little bit to do with trying marijuana and having actually a really bad experience. But it definitely kind of shocked me out of my reality, and just in general, also had a big experience with Lyme's disease and being in really poor health. I think that we talked about this before, that crisis and trauma can really wake you up. And it seems like we're going through that at a global level with the kind of climate change alarmism and the biodiversity problem, pollution, just people becoming really aware of corruption, and just the world going to hell in a handbasket is making people wake up and say, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for. This is not what I want for my world. I want to do something about it. So, can you tell me a little bit about fear? Just because we're in the coronavirus pandemic and a lot of people are in fear, and the fear doesn't match the risk. I mean, if you look at the amount of deaths just in the United States, for example, it's less than we've had for the flu. you know, it's way less than the people who die of suicide and car accidents and heart attacks and all these other things. So, can you tell me a little bit about your perspective on getting out of fear? What is that process to you?
Yeah, sure. And we talked a little bit about this in terms of the hormonal aspects and the chemical aspects in the body in the last video that we went through. So I'd fully encourage folks to go and check that out in terms of the hormonal piece, where we talk a little bit about adrenaline and cortisol and what that actually does to your system in terms of inverting the way that we regularly should be. But from a fear perspective, we can also talk about something right down to the minutiae of your cells, which involves DNA, which many people might not be aware. So I'll walk you through exactly how DNA kind of works on a very surface level in terms of the way that it is formed and how it works. So DNA is essentially like a spiral within the nucleus of our cells, okay? And if this spiral is cohesive, and by that what I mean that it is formed in a correct way, then everything is great in one's life, and there is no, what's the best way to describe it? There's no reaction taking place. There's no kind of fear moments that are happening. And we're feeling in a state of well-being. And DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, which is essentially a self-replicating material present in nearly all living organisms as the main constitutive like chromosomes, and DNA is essentially the carrier of genetic information, right? So what are chromosomes? Well, chromosomes are like this thread-like structure of nucleic acids and proteins that are found in the nucleus of all of your cells that carry the genetic information in the form of genes. And the reason why I mention this is because it's interesting from a behavior perspective, because a British doctor called Glenn, I believe his surname is pronounced Rain, R-E-I-N. He discovered from working as a biochemist in the University of London that DNA behaves in direct response to human consciousness. Okay? So he was able to show that these DNA strands that normally form perfectly and are cohesive will actually unwind and release some of their properties when a cell is about to divide, or it's been damaged, or it's about to die. And what he also discovered was that conversely, it winds back up when it's working to repair or heal itself. Okay? So the amount of unwinding or winding in the DNA that's happening, he discovered during his experiments, can be directly measured by how well it's absorbing light at a certain level of frequency, which is related to UV light, and how well we are absorbing light. Okay, he actually did experiments with UV light. And this, he discovered, was affecting both the DNA and the RNA. And most crucially in his studies, what he found was that individuals could wind or unwind this chromosome DNA pattern within each of the nucleus of our cells by nothing more than the power of our human thought alone.
So what kind of thoughts would cause cohesion?
So in terms of cohesive thoughts, what he observed was that heavy concentration, i.e. thoughts that were, the words that I use are cohesive, so they are in a state where your body, where you're feeling, regular, you're feeling healthy, you're feeling in control and within your center. So think meditation. Big reason why meditation is such a big piece of this is that you're emitting thoughts that are solid, cohesive, and beneficial both to your physical body, but also on the DNA level, this winding up and closing in of the kind of helix, okay? And so what he found was that the individuals with the most coherent brainwave patterns, which we would say today would be kind of like the monk-like qualities of highly trained meditators, they had the strongest ability to change this structure of the DNA, which to me is fascinating.
This reminds me of the Escher illustration of the hand that's drawing itself, because we as human beings with our human consciousness, it's like we can create ourselves and we can create our own perceptions and our own reality and our own physical being. Like we can choose what nutrients we put inside of us, and it creates our being. We can choose our state of mind. We can choose if we're going to watch TV or if we're going to do meditation. So we're really self-created beings in some sense, or co-creators. And the other thing that came to mind when you were talking is that there's a microcosm of the DNA, of the nucleus of the cell, and if that's coherent, then the physical body and the being is coherent. And then if the being is coherent, that has an implication for the societal or the global consciousness. So we really have to get down to the root. And we talked about purification. Do you want to get into the next phase after you get out of fear? Can you talk about purification?
Well, yeah. I mean, in terms of the studies that Rain did and other people, including other physicists based in Germany, we found that we can wind and unwind this DNA by nothing more than the power of our own thoughts, okay? So heavy concentration And this meditative state being a state where once we're fully aligned, everything is working really amazingly, okay? You mentioned also society and the way that we behave within society. Well, very interestingly, this also apparently, according to NASA, which, take it or leave it, this same helix structure is seen at the very center of our galaxy. So not only would it be on a microcosmic level within the DNA of our individual nucleus of our cells, as well as the physical nature of our physical body, but it also, like you identify, extrapolates out into the wider society and then eventually out into, on a cosmic scale, out to the universe. So when we're under stress, let's say, there's a theoretical biophysicist, I think is the correct term, for a gentleman called Fritz Albert Popp, who was from the University of Marburg in Germany. And he discovered that this is actually correlated with light, funnily enough, right? So when the structure of the DNA is balanced, we will be able to absorb more of these light protons. So in effect, what we're doing if we move into fear and this kind of spiral kind of unravels is that we're kind of giving off the stored light, you could call it ultraviolet light, I believe is the most readily detectable type of light that they can actually measure with this. But you're actually kind of giving away your vitality and your energy if this helix kind of unwinds. And this is a direct correlation to what happens when we go into fear. Ignoring for now all of the parts we mentioned last time about the hormone responses. So really interesting. In order to get healthy again, we need to kind of charge our DNA back up on a cellular level by taking care of our bodies on a physical level so that we can, in essence, get the light back in and start bringing the light back into our bodies.
And this corresponds to a lot of traditions, like Taoism, for example, where they talk about having a light body and being able to become invisible or travel, with your light body. So I've heard different teachers mention this in different traditions, like mostly Eastern, of this idea of developing a light body and traveling with a light body. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are many esoteric and exoteric traditions that talk about the exact same thing. The Merkabah in kind of a Melchizedek kind of tradition would talk about this exact thing. Even deep levels of Christianity would talk about it and they actually reference it within the Bible. I believe it's in Matthew, where there's a direct relationship to if your eye be single and all of your body be filled with light, then yeah, there's that part in the Bible that it eventually talks about the results that would happen there. But the key thing here is that our mind and our emotions are directly affecting how much of this kind of light that we can bring in. And this is physical. This is not just, some kind of wacky kind of story in terms of esotericism and all this stuff. This is actually what I believe many of these texts were kind of referring to when they were talking about light, because it was kind of like a manual for you to get the physical body into a kind of elevated state so that you would just experience even greater kind of, mansions in this reality that we live in, where they talk about in the Bible, my Father's house have many mansions, right?
Yeah, so, we have a lot of Christian viewers, and sometimes they get freaked out when you talk about different religions and practices. But it also says, Jesus says, even greater things than what I've done, you will do. So I think we can all agree that the human body in today's modern society is in a state of potential and degeneration But if we clean it up, if we clean up our diet, if we clean up our lifestyle, we clean up our mind and our heart and our emotions, then all of a sudden there's this like natural evolution of our physical bodies and our beings, of these latent capabilities becoming activated. Things like intuitive, for example, intuitive abilities, and perhaps others as well. Anything you want to say about ascension and upgrading your being and what you've experienced as you've cleaned up your lifestyle? Because you used to be overweight and probably ate fish and chips all the time. I don't know what you went from, but I know now you have a super healthy lifestyle. So what was your journey, and what have you experienced as you've been upgrading?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was fish and chips, beer, pizza, lots of meat, ton of sugar, um, out with the boys on a Friday night up until around about that 2009, 2011 kind of period, right? And yeah, so on a physical level, I changed the way I was eating. On a physical level, changed the way that I was exercising to focus a little bit more on yoga and stretching, because that's a kind of much more yin approach as opposed to the kind of crazy yang approach of the gym, which is beneficial as well, don't get me wrong. But in terms of some of the really key pieces that I found really helped, especially with the fear part, which is kind of what we're talking about in this segment, is forgiveness. Learning how mind control kind of works, which is what we're all kind of seeing with the way the mainstream media is playing out right now, especially in terms of command language and psyops that are taking place, in my opinion, right now. And really just in terms of how to get into coherence through calming oneself down, through forgiveness, through effective breath work, and remaining calm. The clarity that comes when you just come back into calmness within yourself is astounding. Right.
So, but
yeah,
this sounds very down to earth and practical. You know, if you're calm, you're going to have more clarity, you're going to be sharper, you're going to make better decisions. But have you experienced a difference in your capabilities, a difference in your, like I'd mentioned, maybe developing intuitive abilities that you never had before? Have you noticed a difference with things like that?
yeah, absolutely. And in relation to purification, that's really what you get, because my wife and I kind of joke in terms of the levels of creativity that you have when you are purer are such that you're kind of getting these downloads that I certainly didn't get when I was heavily stressed working all the hours that were in the day in London as a lawyer, right? I was barely in survival. But when everything started calming down and everything came back into equanimity, as you described, creativity enhanced. I remembered certain events, getting really deep now in terms of past lives, and yeah, created a much greater connection with, you know, who I am in this particular life and how this is playing out. And it's biblical. You know, this is, in my opinion, this great awakening will happen with or without you, in a sense. Because if you're like
You might
I
get
was
left
back,
behind.
not really. No, I don't believe that in you know the way that a fear mongering kind of, you know, religious text might paint that. I believe we all end up in the same place eventually. However, if you wish to have an experience here on earth that is just the most incredible experience you can possibly have in terms of bringing into fruition the things that you would like to create, or having the relationships that you've always desired, purification is one of the fastest ways in my experience to get there.
We talked
Because
last time about doing fasting and doing cleanses. Is there anything else you wanted to mention about purification, how to do it?
well, yeah, I mean, You can start with fasting, like we talked about, in terms of um, not only fasting from your particular food that you're taking in, but also fasting from other things like, your social media, horror movies, um, crazy, stuff that you always tend to do, checking your phone all the time, receiving all the blue light from the screen, etc. These are all different ways of fasting, right? So there are many different kind of layers that you can take this to, where you can start with the physical body, but then you can take care of that quite quickly and then move up into more of the mental mind chatter kind of stuff, which a lot of people are still being played with right now, even as
Yeah.
this, as you identified at the beginning, the stats are such that this thing is not the big crazy virus that we thought it would be, or we were told it would be. But like we say, all of the ancient texts are pretty much in agreement that this is a time when chaos is kind of occurring, right? And it's mimicked in the collective because a lot of people are very much out of cohesion physically, right? So what do you get with that when people are being triggered all the time by all these different, messages that are coming at you through the media, and you're carrying an extra, 20 pounds or what have you, and you're feeling depressed, right? I had all these things, trust me, and they recurred, and I couldn't get rid of them. But there are ways, the very, very simple ways that you can come through, and in tandem with the way that I believe this great awakening will happen, you can kind of rise with that energy as the kind of collective kind of rises, in a sense, both the earth and the individuals that are living on the planet, and not feel sick with it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because that's a
you were mentioning kind of an optimistic viewpoint that everyone is going to end up going to a higher state of consciousness. I kind of see things a little bit differently, which is that as the Great Awakening is happening, people getting more and more of the clear choice between good and evil, or light and dark, or truth and ignorance. So right now, a lot of people are in ignorance. They're just accepting the information from the mainstream media. They're basically like children. They're kind of innocent in their ignorance. But as the truth trickles out and it starts to become a flood of truth, then they have to make a choice. Like, which side am I on? Do I want to stay in ignorance, or do I want to explore the truth? Do I want to be a part of the old story of mind control, of victim and perpetrator, or am I willing to take a leap to a new dimension of being, which involves, you know, more equitable type of relationships that aren't so manipulative, and this ends up being a choice between heaven or hell. So you can stay, if you want to stay in darkness, if you want to stay in ignorance, if you want to stay with the old story, then you're going to be in a state of hell. And if you are open to the truth, and you commit to it, and you say, I'm going to stand in the truth, I'm only going to speak the truth, I'm only going to look at the truth, I'm only going to associate with people who are aligned with the truth, then I think we're going to, along with the physical journey that you talked about, we're going to start living more and more in a state of heaven.
right. And just so that you know, what I was saying before about where we end up, that's when we're all dead. Okay, so I was referencing
Okay.
that once we all die, we all go back
Well,
to this
what do
beautiful
you think
place.
happens to people who are like vicious serial killers after they die? Don't they have a karmic debt? You know?
Well, what could we talk about with that? I mean, once you reach a place, let's say, let's talk about, okay, let's go there. That's great. Let's talk about when we die. In my opinion, and this is based on quite a few lifetimes worth of experience, is that we go back to the pure source. So the very highest level of, let's call it vibration, that you referenced earlier. And at that point, we all get a chance to kind of take a look at what happened during our lives, and we get a choice in terms of the next kind of, experience that we're going to have as to how that will play out. And so in many respects, there's a lot of forgiveness that takes place when you're in that kind of state. Because if you can imagine the best you've ever felt, the calmest you've ever felt, and the most forgiving you've ever been, it's highly unlikely that you were going to lash out at someone and tell them they were just the worst piece of, thing on the earth. And this leads back to our very first discussion we ever had, actually, in terms of when this process plays itself out, if it does in the collective now with all the individuals that have been mentioned in Qanon and all this stuff, do we move into, castigating them and pointing the finger and saying you're scum and all this stuff? Or do we move into a space once they've admitted that they had done something that was outside of, what we would call rational living, we then move into a state of forgiveness. And for me, it's very important that forgiveness is encompassed within this process of the Great Awakening, because otherwise we're missing out on half of the story, right? Because let's say a lot of authors will talk about how we're all here on this grand stage. Shakespeare will talk about this, where we're all playing a role, right? We're all actors on this grand stage of life where there are the good guys, the bad guys, the great guys, the healthy guys, the unhealthy guys. And everyone is kind of playing their role, so that in duality, if I'm taking a certain action, I can say, okay, well, that was good compared to what someone else might have been doing, which would be seen as bad. But at the end of the day, everyone was just playing a role. And that's a tough one for a lot of people to kind of get their heads around, because our instinctive primal brain is one that just says, you did this, you're going down, you've got to be taken out, let's take these guys out.
Yeah, but, I'm not sure. I've never remembered a past life, so I'm not sure how I feel about this whole kind of model of the afterlife. But I will say that when the Great Awakening happens, and when there's mass accountability for the perpetrators in the world, we have a choice to make. Are we going to be mirroring their character with vengeance and violence and hate, or are we going to go into forgiveness? Now, at the same time, forgiveness does not mean acceptance. Forgiveness does not mean you don't have boundaries, because we can never forget. We can never forget Nazi Germany. We can never forget the Holocaust. We can never forget the modern day Nazis and the modern day Holocaust that's occurring right now. And so we can't just give them a slap on the wrist and say, be a good boy now. There has to be full accountability. There has to be, imprisonment. And that's why I'm kind of leaning towards the idea of an afterlife being that if a soul is supposed to be going on a learning journey and they don't learn the lesson they need to learn, and they do bad things, then they end up being forced to actually go through another lesson of life schooling, if it's reincarnation, or if it's a choice of will you choose the light or the darkness. I've heard some Christian theologians kind of phrase it this way, that if you want to say F you to God, if you want to give the middle finger to God and say, I don't want anything to do with you and your throne and your heaven and anything you have to do with, well, then it's your choice. If you want to be in the lower dimension, if you want to be in hell, if you want to suffer, then that is ultimately your choice. So it is fascinating to hear your perspective on the afterlife, because I think it's important for us to face the darkness and decide how we're going to react to it. I, for one, I'm not one of those people talking about hanging the traitors and getting the rope and executions and all this stuff. Like, we cannot go there, because the anger, the hate, the violence, the murder, that is from the darkness, that is from evil. And so at the same time, accountability according to the rule of law is fine with me, but we can't like get happy about murdering people. So we have to go into forgiveness, and it's not easy. Maybe we can wrap things up with, what do you think works when someone's done something horrible, and you feel a lot of emotions about that, and it's very, very hard to forgive them? How do you let go of that? How do you forgive someone or something?
Sure. I mean, one of the most natural ways is the time and the afflection of time. Like you say, in the moment, as the moment is upon you and things are all slightly chaotic, and in this instance, let's say the truth does reveal itself as it's being painted within QAnon, there will have to be a form of justice in terms of exactly what these guys have done and what's been taking place without people knowing about it. And there will have to be a process of kind of rehabilitation, which is really what the prison system is aimed at. And in exactly the same way as you painted earlier, the idea that we can be creating a state of hell within our physical vessel, or a state of heaven within our physical experience. This is what we're going to have to do in this particular circumstance as well. And time is a healer, and understanding of exactly what happened before it led up to what we would call heinous events that took place. What happened in the lead up to that? What happened in the individual's childhood as they were being raised into, this sort of thing? So, and that kind of information will probably come out as we go along. But
for example, the people who are doing sexual abuse, a lot of times they've been sexually abused as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the more we understand the abuse and the mind control that someone's been under, the more that we can forgive them for doing the same acts to others.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
But they still might need to be kept in prison for the rest of their lives, because if they're not able to rehabilitate, then they don't want them hurting other people.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Potentially, yeah.
Thank you for everything, Simon. Is there anything you want to mention about how people can learn more about you and how you help people with health?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have a process that's 8 weeks long. It's called the Truth Series. It covers all of the aspects that we've kind of touched on very briefly here today in terms of mindset, energy gain, and also the physical body techniques that we teach. We've been doing this for around about 2 years now, and we've had incredible success with pretty much everyone that's come on board. So yeah.
So you help people purify their minds and their bodies, and sometimes that's with weight loss as well, right?
Yeah, if individuals need that, it can involve weight loss. That's one of the first steps that we kind of cover. Because we just bring the body back into this cohesive state, kind of mimicking the DNA, I guess you could say, from the early part of our discussion, so that we are, the body then is energized, so it doesn't produce the hormones that will result in energy being stored on the body as fat. So the body just naturally sheds the weight. And then you come into this completely new physical way of living.
Yeah, I've seen the before and after pictures of you. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I've got a few coming up, hopefully, from some clients as well. So I'll share those with you once they're all done as well.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Looking forward to our next chat, and have a good one.
Great. Thanks, Sean.
If you would like to be a sponsor of my channel and reach 30,000 intelligent, patriotic, and selfless viewers every day, just email me at QAnonFAQ.com.